Hi guys, this is Arkelle here, and today I'm here with my first installment of my OC, or Original Character, workshop, where I'll be helping you guys learn to create original characters of your own. Now, before I get right in it, please remember that anything said in these videos is only my own observations and recommendations, and I do not count them as the absolute or unquestionably right way to do things. I'm by no means a professional, so any advice that I give you guys is with the understanding that I'm merely just passing along information and what I have learned, and because people have requested it. Alright, so in this first installation, I'll be talking about a question I get almost constantly, and that's how do you go about naming your original characters? Something I hear quite a lot is that people tell me they have a difficult time naming characters, especially when it comes to finding unique names or names that really suit the character. Well, like I said, I'm no expert by any means, but naming is one of my absolute favorite things to do when designing characters. So, let me just show you all the things I know about names. Now, first, I'm going to start off with some very important rules to remember when naming characters. Rule number 1. First and foremost, the most important thing to remember about naming characters is to never, ever create a character around only a name. Remember that you're trying to find a name that fits a character, not a character that fits a name. This concept is very, very important, so to help you guys better understand this, let me explain this further using a picture. Now, in order for you to better understand why it is not a good idea to base a character around a name, I've drawn two little containers. Now, you see the first one over here already has a name on it, but it has nothing in it. Now that this container has been labeled, your mind will subconsciously try to place things in that container that it feels fit within that label, or in this case, the name. You may not realize it, but your mind is always trying to put together things by association, or to stereotype. This is because it's easier for our brains to process the information and to understand it better when we can place it into categorical systems. Now that this container has already been labeled, your brain will want to place things into that container that it feels fit within that category, or in this case, the name. Your knowledge of that name or what you associate with it will come into play, meaning that it'll be more common for you to design a stereotypical character for that name. On the other hand, when you have an empty container, your brain does not know how to process it yet. The container doesn't have a label, so your brain cannot associate anything with it or try to place things inside it that it feels should belong there by association because there is nothing to associate with. Now you have the opportunity to fill that container with anything you please without subliminally thinking about what should fit into that container or name based on its label. Rule number 2. Avoid common names if possible. A general rule to stick to is to avoid extremely common names at all costs. Of course, there are times when a common name will make the most sense to have for a particular character, but I'll get into that later. But if this isn't the case, do your best to avoid them. Now, I'm not saying that every name you choose has to be completely unheard of or completely original, but make sure that you're not lazily naming characters. So why are common names good to avoid? Well, if your name is Maria or Michael or something like that, then you probably already know why. Chances are, when you were in school, there was at least one other kid in your class with the same name, maybe even every single year. When a name is too common, it becomes very easy to forget. If you make the choice to give a large number of your characters very common names, you are, in essence, cutting a portion of their opportunity to stand out. However, you can use this to your advantage. If you want a character to go unnoticed or not to have a lot of attention drawn to them, common names are much more suitable. However, as a general rule, if you're looking for names, you should try to rule out all exceedingly common names unless they make sense to that particular character. Rule 3. Consider the character's ethnicity, upbringing, and parents. Now, continuing on what I said about common names and how they can make the most sense for a character, sometimes a character's ethnicity, upbringing, and parents can be a huge factor in what names they would realistically have. If your character or story has strong ties to their culture or family, then you need to consider how that would affect their names. For example, a name like Galaxy is not something that we would typically hear in today's world. This is because it does not fit within the stereotypical standards of naming, nor does it reflect any sort of ethnic group. When choosing a name, you have to ask yourself, would this character's parents name them this? Or, how did they come up with that name? If you can't answer these questions, then you should not give your character that name. Also, if your character's parents are very conservative, chances are they will not be giving an outlandish name to their child. In this case, a common name may make the most sense for the character to have, and that's just fine, but be sure that the majority of your characters do not have exceedingly common names. Another thing that I really need to stress is the importance of ethnicity when it comes to names. Now, I know some of you may want to use Japanese names for every single character in your story, but please understand that unless the characters are ethnically Japanese or were born in Japan, it does not make sense for them all to have Japanese names. If your story takes place in medieval England, for example, it doesn't make sense for all your characters to be Japanese or to have Japanese names. Of course, Rule 3 does not necessarily need to be adhered to in the case of a story that does not follow the naming patterns seen in today's world. However, if that is the case, make sure that you well articulate that in your story, or else it will seem like laziness to the readers. Rule 4. Consider the world in which the character resides. This is something very important to consider. Yes, I personally do use a lot of very odd names or unique names for my characters, but you have to understand that if Rule 3 doesn't apply, ultimately their names make sense to the world in which they reside in. What I mean is, if you're writing a story that is set in today's time period on Earth, no different than it is right now, naming your characters very outlandish names will seem very out of place. Alternatively, if your story takes place in a fantasy world with dragons and fairies and things like that, naming your characters names that are common today in real life would probably not make much sense either. For a name to really fit, you need to think of the things beyond just the characters themselves. As stated in Rule 3, there will be times when a character's ethnicity or parents will be irrelevant, but it is still important their name fit within whatever world they live in, or in the context of the story. Rule 5. Avoid names that are exceedingly difficult to pronounce. Names that are spelled very complexly or that use a different type of inflection or pronunciation than people are used to can be a very big problem, especially if you yourself can't even pronounce your own character's name. Though originality is a big part of naming, if a name is too hard for the majority of people to pronounce, then it might be a good idea to consider either changing the name or spelling it phonetically. Not always do you need to change a difficult name. Sometimes you can make small edits to the way the name is spelt, and it will make it much easier to pronounce, especially when it comes to names that can be interpreted multiple ways based on the spelling. For example, the name Kale can be spelled many different ways. However, if you are trying to be as phonetically simple as you can, spelling it K-A-L-E will be much easier for people to understand than if you were to spell it C-A-E-L. This is a very simple example, but you can use this trick for complex and original names as well. Try to make them as easy for people to understand as possible, especially if the name will only ever be read and not pronounced out loud. Rule 6. Make sure there is variety within your characters' names. Sometimes you may encounter that a lot of the names you like for your characters are very similar, either in sound, essence, origin, or otherwise. Though it is okay to have a certain amount of similarity within your characters' names, be sure not to overdo it. For example, say you have 3 characters named Millie, Missy, and Mary. Now, let's just assume that these 3 characters are not sisters, and these are not nicknames. These 3 names all start with the same letter, have the same amount of syllables, and all end with the letter Y. If you have too many characters with names so similar, it'll be hard for people to remember who is who. It also makes your characters seem less unique and individual because there are so many characters with such similar names. This rule doesn't just apply to the way names sound though. It can also be the origin of names that are too common. though it would make perfect sense to give all of your Japanese characters Japanese names. If it gets to the point where every single character in your story has the same name origin, the names will again begin to pile up on each other and make all the characters seem a bit less unique. If you want to make sure that every character you create gets a fair opportunity for their name to be remembered, there needs to be a good amount of variety, or else you'll be cutting your characters short. Think about it this way. If you were to put your names of all your OCs into a hat and pick just one, would you, or your fan base, be able to quickly discern who that character is from just their name? When you have too many names that sound similar, it makes it harder to differentiate between them purely by their names. Rule 7. Do not decide on a name for a character unless you can justify it. Remember, it is okay to have second thoughts about the name you want for your character as they develop. The more you develop a character, the easier it will be for that character to form a real bond to a name. A character that is empty, with infinite possibilities still open, has just as many possibilities for names. So, never commit to a name unless you can justify that character having that name. For example, what does that name mean to the character? Or does it reflect their ethnic background? Does it make sense for the character to have that name given their parents or the world they live in? Is it ironic to the character? Does it play off another character's name? If you can't find at least one legitimate reason for naming your character something, do not commit to that name. Later on down the road, you will realize that their name was not thought out fully and it does not reflect their character. Alright, now that I've gone over the rules for naming, now let me get into some methods that you can use to go about naming. One of the most common methods that I use to name characters involves the meaning behind the name and how it may apply to the character. You may not be aware, but almost every name has some kind of other meaning to it. A lot of times, the names we use today are variants or combination of words that have a meaning, therefore transferring that meaning onto the new word, or in this case, to the name. Rarely is a name ever just a name or a random word that we call ourselves. Sometimes names can be very literal in their meaning, other times you may never guess what the character's name means just by the name itself. Either way, if you ever struggle with finding a name for your original characters, think about their personalities or the things that define them. It's a great way to go about finding a name. Now, I'll talk more about how you can actually go about doing that a bit later. For now, let's move on to the concept of literal names. Naming your characters very literally can be an option too, and it's essentially a variant of naming based off of meaning. However, instead of you finding a name that means something in relation to your character in a hidden or non-obvious way, a literal name, of course, will be very obvious. So what really is the difference? Well, for example, say you want to name your character based on the meaning Grace. Now, if you were naming literally, you would literally call your character Grace, just like that. This is a very obvious tie-in with the graceful side of their character. On the opposite side of that same coin, naming your character something like Charisse or Annabelle would be naming your character with the principles of meaning without being quite so literal, as both Charisse and Annabelle mean graceful. Literal names are tricky and take a bit of balance to pull off. If all of your characters are named literally, chances are it will be perceived by other people as laziness, when it comes to naming at least. Because literal names are, of course, literal, they do not evoke a lot of creativity as they are. Not only that, a literal name will immediately make people assume things about that character. For example, if you do have a character named Grace, with that name, people will assume a certain amount of gracefulness from that character. This is not always true, but again, our brains work by association, so keep in mind this scenario will undoubtedly occur at least once with a literal name. However, literal names can be used in a manner that I like to call trick naming, but I'll get to that in a minute. There's really nothing that says a literal name has to be literal to the context of your character, however. In fact, naming a character Grace, who is the opposite of graceful, can be a fun and ironic twist to your character. It will change people's expectations set by their brain's association, so consider using literal names just as you would any kind of trick name. So, what exactly is a trick name? Trick names, as I call them, are names that in some way fool the reader. I myself use a lot of trick names in a specific one of my stories. For example, if you guys know my characters, and you know that some of my characters have names designed to be tricky. My character Fire over here, for example, spells his name with a PH rather than an F. Fire with a PH and Fire with an F are pronounced exactly the same, but the PH is there just as a trick and is relevant to his character's eccentric nature. My characters Asterisk and Apostrophe are also examples of a different type of trick name. They don't actually spell out their entire names as words like they are meant to be spelt. Instead, they abbreviate them by the punctuation marks they are named after. This is another form of trick name because it is abbreviated a different way than it is spelled. Trick names are a lot of fun to use and can add a lot of interest to your characters. More than anything, it makes them unique and gives them a special quirk to call their own. I myself use a trick name when I sign my signature on my art. I spell it this way as my artist signature, but I write it this way when I refer to myself in any other circumstance. Though it is pronounced the same, the only reason it is different is because it is my own little unique quirk. Remember that you should set out to make your characters with as much depth as a real person has, so giving them a trick name can be just the thing to make a character more unique and definitive. A cool thing about choosing a name for a character is that with that, you have the ability to give them different nicknames. Chances are at least one person in your life calls you something other than your full name. If this is the case, you have a nickname. Nicknames are great tools to use for character depth and development, just as a trick name is. If a character has a nickname for another character, it means that there is a bond between them, sometimes good or bad. And, moreover, a character can technically have an infinite number of nicknames because they can be different for each person or situation. But more so than that, what I want to tell you about nickname is that in some cases, they can serve as a second name for a character. Chances are, if you have a really long, complex, or silly name, you probably like to be referred to by something else. The same can be true for your characters. Just because a character was given a really long, boring, or stupid name by their parents, it doesn't necessarily mean they have to embrace it. In the case of a character that has a very conservative name but a very eccentric lifestyle, it is not unusual for them to have another more edgy name that they are referred to. Again, nicknames are another tool you can use to further extend the depth of the name that you can bring to a character. Alright guys, now I'm going to go ahead and show you some useful resources that you can use when naming your characters. Now, the first thing that I would like to recommend, of course, sometimes people ask me, oh well, Arkelle, I don't really know a lot of different types of names, and how do you go about finding names? Now, something that I really particularly enjoy is baby name sites. Now, of course, this is a resource that parents will use to name their children. And as character designers, we are pretty much making children of our own in a sense, so it would make sense that we would use some of the same resources. Now, I know that some people would, not recommend using baby name sites, but I actually highly do. Of course, naming a character is not so simple as, just seeing a name and, sticking it on a character like you would a Band-Aid, as I like to put it. But, if you're not familiar with a lot of different types of names, finding names is on baby name sites is a really great thing to do when you're first looking for names. Of course, then you will want to research them and see if they actually fit your character. But basically, I just did a basic Google search, and the first thing that pops up is babynames.com. And this is a great resource to use. The first thing that you can see on this page that you want to pay attention to is a little box here called Today's Trending Names. Now, of course, I always tell you to pay attention to the time period in which your characters reside in, so you can pick names that are appropriate to their time and or world. Another thing that is very important to know is that trending names, names that are gaining popularity right now, you want to keep track on those, because if a name gets too popular, it can change the way your character is perceived, especially if you are making a brand new character and you happen to use a name that is very trending, it's very popular at this very moment. It might actually seem like some people will be copying your name or you didn't put a lot of thought into it. So just as a safety precaution, make sure that you do searches on trending names at the moment, regardless of whatever time period your character happens to be in. Now, another cool thing in this particular site is you can go ahead and search names by letter.
So just for the lulz, let's go ahead and click on the letter A. Now, it will bring up many pages through, you can see a name through a name, in alphabetical order, all these names that start with the letter A in this particular case. And you can also filter them by either girl names, boy names, or of course genderless and or unisex names. So you can go ahead and do that. Another cool resource that if you scroll down here, you can also explore the names by origin. So say you want your particular character to be of a certain ethnic descent, you can go ahead and click on these pages down here, and it will bring up a list of names in a similar fashion as this based on that particular ethnicity. Another resource that is very useful in this particular site is that if you hover over a particular name, it will tell you the origin in which it is from and a basic translation of what it could possibly mean. Of course, I will say that not necessarily all of these are 100% accurate, but it will give you a basic idea of what they could mean. Or what they feel that they mean based on a certain amount of research. Of course, you would never just take the opinion of one person solely based on that, so it is always, of course, a good idea to Google, research the name in particular that you're thinking of using to get a better sense of exactly what the meaning will be, not just using one resource as your entire guidelines here. Okay, so another resource that is particularly useful too is the U.S. government site. Now, of course, we don't live in the U.S. I'm assuming they probably have something similar in other parts of the world. Maybe not. I'm not sure. But if you do live in the U.S., the U.S. government has a keeps track of the most popular names by year. So you can go ahead and this is the top 10 baby names for 2011. You can go ahead and see the 10 most popular names for both genders. You can go ahead and do that. You can also scan names by decade, state, and for twins. Another resource that you can do is you can put any year that you possibly want. So say your character is born, in 1950. If you want to go ahead and search the popular names for that time so you can find names that are more historically accurate, you can go ahead and just put that in there and see what the popular names were that time as well. However, if you also have a name that you already picked out and you want to see how popular it is, you can go ahead and just use this resource, popularity of name, and go ahead and just stick that in this box and see how popular it's been within how many years of however many years you want it to be. Now, another resource you can also use too is Baby Zone here. Now, basically, let me go back here. Basically, what this has is it will find you names based on kind of similar to the way babynames.com does, but you can go ahead and filter it by yourself rather than sort of looking around. Now, basically what you would do here is just pick whatever particular gender you're looking for, and you can go ahead and put in a origin if that suits your needs. You can go ahead and put in an origin. I'm going to go ahead and put in Greek here. You can also do number of syllables and starting letter and ending letter. For this particular purpose, I'm just going to go ahead and use the starting letter of C and go back to the page I was just on and get the search results. There we go. And see, you can see these are all female names that originate in Greek. So you can go ahead and use that too if you're looking. And this is a particular letter. They all start with C. As you can see, here's one of my characters named Calliope. So yeah, if you're looking for that particular thing, you can also do that too. It would really help if there's one particular letter and you want a certain feel to it, you can go ahead and do that, and that is very useful as well. Now, one of the things that I want to encourage you to do, of course, too, is I always talk about how you should never name a character just based on a name. You should have to justify it. Now, if you can't justify it based on time period or any kind of other things similar to that, you want to justify it based on meaning to your character. So let's say, and just hypothetically, that your character has something to do with the element of light. There's some kind of essence of light that applies to their character. Now, you can go ahead and just Google this, names, meaning, and then whatever the word that you want to associate with your character is. Now, in this particular case, like I said, I picked light, and you can see there's quite a number of listings here that will show you some different names that mean light. So let's just go ahead and click on a random resource up here. Now here you can see there's quite a list of names that have been translated to mean something along the lines of light. And these, of course, in this particular site, they're all different origins and whatnot. But you can go ahead and just look at that and see some possibilities. Now, if you can't think of a particular letter or origin for your character, and all you want to base on is a meaning, that is perfectly fine too, and it's a great way to find names that you wouldn't otherwise think of. So you can always just Google this as many times as you want, and as many different meanings as you want. You know, for a particular character, you might not find the one particular name that you're looking for based on one word. Say instead of light, you want to use like brightness or something instead. You can go ahead and just change that to named meaning bright or something, and you could possibly find a name that will work for your character based on that. So these are definitely some resources that I encourage you guys to use. They are very useful, and of course, as I will say always, that, you know, please do not just find a name for your character and just stick it on them. Again, keeping with the last rule I have said and naming, you do want to make sure that your names that you choose can be justified. So, alright, I hope this was informative.
Alright guys, that does it for this session of Character Workshop, all about naming. Now, something that I do want to say before I go is that, yes, it can take quite a bit of time to find the perfect name for your character, but even if it takes you days or weeks or months, don't let that discourage you at all. It's definitely worth the time really researching and thinking about the name that you want for your character. Don't just see something that sounds pretty and stick it on your character, because chances are, like I said, it might not even apply to that character, and later on down the road, you'll really regret that decision, and it can be very difficult renaming a character, especially if they've had their name for a very long time. So, yeah guys, just be patient with the naming process. It can be, you know, I've explained a lot of different aspects of it, and it can be quite difficult and very in-depth. But, of course, just take your time with it and really think not so much about actually naming. I want you guys to think more so than anything about the character, and really think what connects to their character in particular. When you find the right name for that character, you will automatically know that it's that name. If for some reason it will just stick and you'll just know that this is that character's name. So until that really happens, don't worry, just take it slow and try to find that perfect name. So I hope this has helped you guys. Sorry it took me a bit longer to do this little tutorial than my others. I've been kind of busy, like I said, but I hope this has been informative, and thank you guys so very much for watching, and there will definitely be more videos in the future. So, as always, bye!